Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. The previous owner said it the way you'd mentioned that the garbage trucks come on Thursdays, casual and informational, standing in the driveway after the closing while we were all still holding copies of documents that had just changed hands. His name was Ferrell, and he was a quiet man in his late 60s who had maintained the property alone for the 11 years he'd owned it, and who had accepted our offer within 2 days of the listing going up, which our realtor had described as motivated selling, and which I had not thought much about at the time. He shook my hand and then my wife Dessa's hand and said he hoped we'd be happy there. And then, already turning toward his car, he said it. "Don't dig in the backyard." Dessa asked him why, and he said the drainage out back was complicated and that digging could disturb the grading he'd worked out over the years. He said it pleasantly, and it sounded plausible, and he was in his car and pulling out before either of us thought to press further. We stood in the driveway of our new property and watched him go, and then looked at each other, and Dessa made the face she makes when something is slightly odd, but not odd enough to ruin the moment. And we went inside. That was late April. By July, we'd mostly forgotten he'd said it. The drainage problem announced itself after a heavy rain in the second week of August. The northwest corner of the backyard held water badly, pooling to a depth that killed the grass and left a soft depression in the ground that didn't dry out between storms. I had a contractor named Whitfield come out to look at it, a local man who did residential drainage work and who came recommended by 2 separate neighbors. He walked the yard with me on a Thursday morning and agreed that the corner needed a French drain running to the property edge. He said it was a straightforward job, 2 or 3 days at most, and that he could start the following week. I told him about Ferrell's warning, and he listened and nodded and said he'd be careful about the grading. He started on a Monday. I was working from home and checked on the crew twice in the morning and found them making normal progress, the trench running clean and even from the corner toward the fence line. Around 2 in the afternoon, the equipment stopped. I looked out the back window and saw Whitfield standing at the far end of the trench, looking down into it. His 2 crew members were standing back from the trench, not at the edge of it, further back, near the fence, not doing anything. I went outside. Whitfield heard me coming and looked up, and something moved through his expression that he got control of before I could read it fully. "We're going to need to stop for today," he said. I looked into the trench. It was about 3 feet deep at the far end, and the soil at the bottom was dark and dense, undisturbed subsoil that shouldn't have looked like anything except subsoil. It didn't look like anything except subsoil. But the air coming up out of it was different from the air above it, cooler, and with a quality that was hard to name, a density to it, like the air in a space that has been closed for a very long time and has stopped moving. "What did you find?" I asked. "Nothing," Whitfield said, which was technically accurate and communicated almost nothing. He looked at the trench again, and then back at me. "I'd like to bring a different crew back tomorrow. I've got some other guys who are better suited for this particular situation." I asked him what particular situation he meant. He was quiet for a moment. "The ground changes down there," he said, "in a way I haven't run into before. I'd rather have fresh eyes on it in the morning." He said it professionally and without drama, and I could tell that this was the version of the explanation he'd decided on, and that there wasn't going to be another one coming. He packed up and left with his crew, and did not come back the following morning, or at all. He called and said he was overbooked, and recommended another contractor and refunded the deposit without being asked, which told me more than anything he'd said in person. The trench sat open in the yard. The sound started that night. Not loud. That's the first thing I'd want anyone to understand who hasn't heard something like it, because I think people imagine these things as dramatic and overwhelming, and this was neither. It was low and continuous and came from everywhere the house touched the ground. The basement walls, the floor joists, the concrete of the foundation, a frequency that the body receives as a feeling before the ears process it as a sound. Like the house was resting on something that was humming. Dessa heard it too. We lay in bed that first night and listened and didn't say much. She asked if it could be the pipes, and I said I didn't know. In the morning it was gone, and the day was ordinary, and we talked about calling a plumber and didn't get around to it. The second night, it was back and slightly different. Not louder, just more specific in its direction, coming more clearly from the northwest corner of the house, which was the corner closest to the open trench in the yard. It ran from around 10 at night until somewhere in the early hours, and then stopped. I lay awake for most of it trying to locate it precisely, and finding that every time I thought I had the direction fixed, it had shifted slightly, the way a sound shifts when the source is moving. On the third night, I got up and went to the basement. The basement was unfinished, concrete block walls and a poured floor, and the northwest corner of it was directly below where the trench ended in the yard above. I stood in that corner in the dark with the sound running through the walls around me and put my hand flat on the concrete block and felt it. Not a vibration exactly, more like a pressure, the same way you feel the bass from a speaker in your sternum from across a room. The block was doing something that concrete block does not do, conducting something from outside it, something that came up from the ground and moved through the foundation, the way cold moves through a wall in winter. I went back to bed and didn't sleep much, and in the morning I drove to the neighboring property. The farm that bordered our western fence line had been operated by the same family for 3 generations, and the man currently running it was named Corbett Haas, who was in his early 60s and who I'd exchanged a total of about 4 sentences with since we'd moved in. He was working on something near his equipment barn when I pulled up, and he straightened and looked at me with the careful watchfulness of someone who's been expecting a particular conversation and isn't looking forward to it. I told him about the trench and the sound. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You dug in that northwest corner?" "The contractor did, yes." He nodded slowly and looked past me toward the tree line along the property edge. Ferrell kept that corner, had to regrade it every couple of years to keep the water sitting on top of it. The standing water was deliberate, the weight of it, He looked back at me. You'd have thought it was a drainage problem. It's not. I asked him what it was. He told me what he knew, which he prefaced by saying he'd gotten it from his father, and his father had gotten it from a man who'd farmed that land before the current property lines existed, so it had passed through enough hands that he couldn't guarantee the accuracy of any specific detail, only the general shape of it. Whatever was under that corner of the yard had been there before any structure on the property. The original family who'd built the house in the early 1920s had encountered it during the initial foundation digging and had stopped and rerouted the foundation to avoid that corner, which was why the house sat off-center on the lot in a way that had puzzled our home inspector and that we'd attributed to the building practices of the era. 3 different owners across the following decades had attempted to build structures in that corner: a shed, a root cellar, a small greenhouse, and in each case the construction had been abandoned without clear explanation, and the ground returned to its original state. By the time Ferrell took ownership, the understanding had become localized folk knowledge, the kind that gets passed between neighboring properties without ever being written down or fully explained. What Corbett knew was this: the thing in the ground was not an object, and it was not remains, and it wasn't anything with a clean category. It was a presence that the ground contained, the way a jar contains something. The standing water had been Ferrell's method of maintaining the containment, the weight and pressure of it keeping whatever was below the surface from orienting upward. When the water was managed off the soil and the soil was opened, the pressure released, and whatever had been held down for long enough that it was going to take some time to figure out where it was now. "What does it want?" I asked, because it seemed like the relevant question. Corbett looked at me steadily. "I don't think want is the right word for it," he said. "I think it just does what it does, and what it does is move through spaces until it finds one that works for it." He paused. "It was in that ground for a long time, longer than the house has been there. It'll need to reorient. And while it reorients..." He didn't answer that directly. He looked at the tree line again for a moment. "Ferrell lived alone," he said. "His wife passed about 5 years into his time there. After that, it was just him keeping the water on that corner and staying in the house." Another pause. "He sold fast when you made an offer." I drove home and sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. That evening, I went into the yard alone. The trench was as Whitfield had left it, open and clean-edged, running from the fence line toward the northwest corner. The far end of it, the deep end, was in shadow, and I stood at the edge of it with a flashlight and looked down. The bottom of the trench had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way I could have taken a photograph of and shown someone as evidence of anything. But the soil at the deep end had a different character than it had when I had looked into it the afternoon Whitfield stopped work. It had been dense and packed then, undisturbed subsoil with the tight grain of ground that hasn't been touched in decades. Now it had a looseness to it, a freshly turned quality, like something had been working through it from below. The air coming up from the trench was the same as before, cool and dense and old. I stood there for a while, and then I filled the trench in myself, working with a spade in the early evening until the ground was level and the corner was closed. I packed it as tight as I could get it, and when I was done, I went inside and washed up and didn't tell Dessa what I'd found at the bottom of the trench. I told her I'd filled it in because we'd get someone better to redo the drainage properly, which was not untrue. The sound that night was louder, not in volume, but in presence. The way a sound gets louder when its source is closer. It was inside the foundation now rather than coming through it from outside, which was a distinction I could feel in the way the floor conducted it differently under my feet. It ran through the house the way a current runs through water, finding the paths of least resistance through the structural material, the wood framing, the subfloor, the wall studs. I sat in the kitchen at 2 a.m. and listened to my house conduct something I couldn't name through every surface it was made of, and thought about what Corbett had said, that it needed to reorient, that it moved through spaces until it found one that worked. I thought about what worked meant. Over the following week, it settled into a pattern that I found harder to live with than I would have found something more dramatic. Nothing broke, nothing appeared, nothing happened in any way that could be described in a police report or a conversation with a contractor. The sound came and went on its own schedule, sometimes gone for a full day and then back the next night, moved through different parts of the house on different nights, sometimes concentrated in the basement and sometimes in the upper floor, and once, on a Thursday night, clearly coming from inside the walls of our bedroom while we lay in the dark and listened to it. Dessa didn't sleep well that week. She didn't say much about it, but I could see her listening even during the day, head tilted slightly, checking for it. We'd stopped talking about the drainage project. We'd stopped talking about a lot of the plans we'd had for the property. On a Saturday morning, she made coffee and set a mug in front of me and sat down across the table and said, very calmly, that she thought we should leave. I told her I thought so too. We were out in 11 days. We moved efficiently and without much discussion about what we were moving away from, which was the only way either of us could do it without it becoming something neither of us was ready to have. We stayed with Dessa's sister in the city while the property went back on the market. The listing described it accurately in all the ways that mattered to a real estate transaction, and in none of the ways that would have mattered to us 11 months earlier when we'd been the ones reading listings. It sold in 3 weeks to a couple from out of state, which I found out from our realtor and which I've thought about more than is useful to me. I did not tell them about the northwest corner. I've examined that decision from several directions since, and I haven't found a version of what I could have said that would have communicated anything actionable. I was the previous owner now. I knew how that conversation went. I knew how much weight a casual warning carries when you're standing in the driveway of a house you've just signed for, and the future of it is still entirely good in your imagination. What I did was call Corbett and tell him what had happened and ask him to watch the new owners the way he'd watched Farrell and the others before him. He said he would. He didn't say it would help. Here's what I haven't told anyone. Not Dessa, not anyone we stayed with, not the realtor. The sound didn't stop when we left. I noticed it the second night at Dessa's sister's place, low and below hearing, coming through the floor of the guest room at a frequency I recognized by then, the way you recognize the voice of someone you've spent enough time with. I lay in the dark and listened to it in a house that had no connection to any of it, no open ground, no disturbed foundation, no northwest corner with a history. And I understood what Corbett had meant by reorienting. It had been in the ground because the ground was what it had available. Now it had something that moved and carried it from place to place without needing to tunnel or surface or wait decades for someone to come along and open the earth above it. It had found something that worked. I haven't told Dessa because she's sleeping through the night again, and I won't take that from her. I manage it the way you manage something you can't do anything about, which is to say, I don't manage it at all. I just live alongside it and try not to give it too much of my attention. Some nights it's quiet, and I almost convince myself it's gone. And I put my hand on the wall next to the bed and feel it there, patient and low and thoroughly settled. And I understand that it isn't going anywhere. It's already home,